The file was sealed with a compact dread designation, which meant Sova Thresh was not supposed to enjoy reading it. She read it anyway. That was, technically, her entire job, to assess threat profiles on anomalous species, prioritize them by calculated danger index, and deliver a summary recommendation to the adjudication chamber before the next rotation cycle. The compact dread seal just meant she was supposed to read it with clinical detachment, log her findings without annotation, and move on to the next file in the queue. She did not do that either. The file on Sergeant Callum Reach, designation Human Terrestrial Survivor 7, sat open on her review station for 11 hours on the first day. She was still reading it when the station's ambient lighting shifted to night cycle. She was still reading it at third bell, when the corridor outside her alcove went quiet enough that she could hear the soft mechanical breath of the compact archive as it turned over into a new log rotation. She flagged 12 passages. She was only supposed to flag 3, maximum per file. Anything beyond 3 was considered a sign of analyst bias. A note would go in her own record. She flagged 12 anyway and added a 13th note at the bottom that read, "This file is either the most sophisticated disinformation package the Compact has ever produced, or the most important piece of intelligence we have received in 400 cycles. I cannot determine which. I need to meet the subject." Her supervisor, Third Auditor Len, read the notation the next morning and immediately scheduled a meeting, which she walked into already regretting. "You want to interview him," Len said. It was not a question. Her vocal frills were drawn flat against her collar structure, which in her species meant careful displeasure. "You understand that the Cathara incident is officially a non-event." "I understand that the Compact has classified it as a non-event," Sova Thresh said. "I'm less certain that the universe has agreed." Len was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You have clearance to conduct a supplementary interview, 1 session. You'll submit the transcript to me before it goes anywhere else." "Of course." "And Sova," Len's frills shifted slightly, not quite displeasure anymore, something harder to read. "Be careful what you go looking for. Sometimes intelligence assessors find things the Compact would prefer remain unfound." Sova Thresh considered this. "With respect, Third Auditor, that's rather the point." The Compact's human containment facilities were not technically called containment facilities. They were called integration transition centers, which sounded friendlier, and which everyone who worked in them knew was a carefully maintained fiction. Sergeant Callum Reach had been living in Integration Transition Center 7 for 14 months. He had a room that locked from the outside. He had access to a small courtyard between the hours of 10 and 14. He had a weekly allocation of what the Compact nutritionists had determined was an adequate human caloric intake, and he had a cot, and he had a single window that looked out over a pale amber sky that was not his sky. He was sitting in the courtyard when Sova Thresh arrived, and the first thing she noticed was that he was watching the sky. Not staring at it the way the Compact's behavioral analysts had noted in their reports, with the listless, unfocused gaze of a creature experiencing what they'd logged as environmental dysphoria. He was watching it with an attention that was almost technical, like a navigator reading currents in unfamiliar water. When the gate to the courtyard opened, he didn't flinch. He turned his head slowly, and he looked at her with eyes that were an unremarkable gray-green color, and that nonetheless felt, immediately, like they were reading something behind her face. "You're not from the behavioral division," he said. His voice was rougher than the audio logs in the file, more tired too. "No." She settled across from him at the small composite table the facility used for visitor interactions. "I'm from intelligence assessment. The ones who decide whether we're dangerous." "The ones who decide how dangerous you are," she said. "There's a difference." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. A slight tension at the corners of his mouth, a brief upward pressure. She had spent 2 years studying human facial expressions, and she still found them startlingly inefficient at concealing internal states. "Okay," he said, "what do you want to know?" "I want to know about the Kithara incident." The almost smile disappeared. He was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder if he was going to refuse. Then he turned his head back toward the amber sky, and he said, in a voice that had gone somewhere distant, "Nobody's asked me that. In 14 months. Nobody's asked me that by name. I know. The intake team, when they processed me, said there was no incident. They said I'd experienced a psychotic break and been extracted. They said the location, the coordinates, they said it was a debris field from a mining accident that happened 40 years ago. They were very thorough about it." He paused. "There were 6 of us." "I know," she said again. "I read your file." "Then you know what happened." "I know what was recorded, what was compiled from sensor logs and autopsy reports, and the testimony of the 2 individuals who were recovered." She set her datapad on the table between them, face down. It was a deliberate gesture. She wasn't here to take notes in the manner that would put him in the position of a subject being documented. "I don't know what it felt like. I don't know the parts that didn't make it into the record. I've been doing this work for 9 years, and the things that don't make it into the record are almost always the most important things." Callum Reach looked at the face-down datapad. He looked at her. He looked at the sky. Then he said, "You want me to tell you what it felt like? I want you to tell me everything you've been carrying that you've never been able to put down." Another silence. Longer. She waited, because patience was the first thing they taught you in assessment work, and the thing that most assessors forgot the moment they were sitting across from an interesting subject. "Okay," he said finally. "Yeah, all right." He leaned forward and put his elbows on his knees, and he started to talk. The mission brief had been classified at 3 levels above his clearance, which was itself a bad sign. In 16 years of service, 3 on Earth, 13 in the off-world assignment rotations that had quietly expanded to fill what the public records called extended diplomatic postings. Callum had learned to read the bureaucratic topology of classified operations. Documents classified above the assigned officer's level usually meant one of 2 things. Either the mission was so sensitive that the people running it didn't trust the people executing it, or the people running it didn't want to have to explain themselves afterward. In his experience, both usually turned out to be true. He and his team had been dropped into the Kithara system via a transit point that didn't appear on any official chart. The system was listed in compact records. He'd seen references to it during his time in the integration centers, in the background materials they'd given him to help him understand the political geography of known space, as an uninhabited trinary system with limited strategic value. No resource deposits of note. No habitable worlds. No reason for anyone to be there. There was a reason for someone to be there. There were, specifically, 4 reasons for someone to be there, and they were the 4 research stations that the Compact's Outer Survey Division had established in the system 12 cycles prior, and then quietly ceased to acknowledge in any official capacity. They were running experiments, Callum said. His voice was steady. Sova had noticed this about him already, the steadiness, the way he delivered information as though he had spent a long time deciding how to hold it. On something that they'd found in the debris field, something old. We didn't know what it was until we got there. "The device," Sova said. He glanced at her sharply. "You know about the device." Sensor logs from extraction Flight X7 referenced an anomalous energy signature consistent with pre-compact dimensional manipulation technology. The designation in the file is redacted, but the description matches the research notes from the Outer Survey Division's inactive archives. "I had to go through 17 access clearance barriers to find those, and I'm still not entirely certain I was authorized to access them." She paused. "I was going to do it regardless." Callum studied her for a moment with that gray-green attention that felt like being read. Then something in his expression shifted, not the near smile this time, but something more fundamental. A slight loosening, like a fist that had been held too long beginning to open. They were using it to look through, he said. The device. That's what the research teams had figured out. It's not a weapon, it's not a power source, it's a window. You put enough energy through it and it opens a view into a place that's adjacent, alongside. A version of the same space with different outcomes. A parallel dimensional interface. If you want to be technical about it. His mouth did the near smile thing again. We called it the window. My team, Specialist Okonkwo, named it actually. She had a talent for cutting through to the plain description of things. He said the name with a careful steadiness that told Sova everything she needed to know about Specialist Okonkwo without having to consult the section of the file marked with red notation. Deceased, KETHARA Station 2, circumstances unconfirmed. The compact research teams had been looking through it for 12 cycles, Callum continued, cataloging what they saw. Apparently in most of the adjacent versions of this region of space, things went differently. Better in some of them. The wars that happened here didn't happen. Species that are extinct are still alive. There was one version where first contact between humanity and the compact went so well that by the time of the view, we were already integrated, already represented in the council structure already. He stopped. Already equal, Sova said. Already equal, he confirmed quietly. She made no notation. She kept her hands still on the table. This was the passage she had flagged, not flagged exactly, since it wasn't in the file, but the version of it that was in the file had been the thing that kept her awake for the second half of her reading session, that had her adding note after note until her supervisor's threshold was crossed. The research teams had documented this adjacent version. They had documented the version where first contact was not a series of calculated territorial assertions, but a genuine meeting. And the documentation had been classified with a seal so comprehensive it took 3 different access keys just to read the summary. Because the compact had looked through the window at a version of reality where humanity was their equal, and the compact's response had been to classify the window and quietly begin the process of determining whether the device could be destroyed. You found all this out when you arrived, she said. When we breached the 3rd station, yeah. The lead researcher, a compact scientist named Vethoron, she told us. She didn't have to. She could have kept up the mission parameters we'd been given. Calibration check on monitoring equipment. Routine assessment. She could have run that story for the duration and we'd have been gone in 72 hours. He paused. She told us because she thought we had a right to know what they'd been doing with our image. Our image, Sova repeated. Looking at us. 12 cycles of looking at parallel versions of us and writing down everything they saw. What we do when we're afraid. What we do when we're trusted. What we do when someone gives us a chance versus what we do when someone decides in advance that we're not worth the chance. His jaw shifted. 12 cycles of documentation, and the conclusion was that humanity is situationally adaptive. That our behavior correlates strongly with the conditions we're placed in. That in the versions of first contact where the compact approached us with openness, we responded with openness. That in the versions where the compact approached us with calculated management, she said. Yeah, quiet, that. She looked at him. He was looking at the amber sky again. That's why they sent your team, she said slowly. Not for a calibration check. No, he exhaled once, a slow, controlled breath that she recognized from compact crisis management literature as a technique for emotional regulation. She wondered if he developed it himself or been taught it. Our orders, the real orders, not the cover, were to assess whether the research teams had developed sympathies that compromised their operational integrity, whether they needed to be recalled. The word landed in the courtyard between them and sat there. Recalled, she said. That's the word they used. She was quiet then. What did you do? And here was the thing she had not been able to get from the file. Here was the 12-hour gap in the sensor logs, the discrepancy in the extraction manifest, the 6 team members who'd gone in and the 2 who'd come out, and the official record that said psychotic break and debris field and asterisk mining accident 40 years ago. Callum Reach turned his head from the sky and looked at her directly, and what she saw in his face was not guilt exactly, but something shaped like guilt that had been lived with long enough to become something more complicated. A landscape you'd been walking for so long it had become part of your body. Specialist Okonkwo, he said, found the documentation archive, the full 12 cycles of observation logs. She started reading them. She was the fastest reader on the team. She always had been. She could move through a technical briefing while the rest of us were still on page 1, and she read for about 3 hours, and then she found the section on the window to the adjacent version. The one where first contact was good. The one where we were equal. He stopped. Started again. There's a version of us parallel humans, equivalent genetic profile, corresponding history but with one branching point about 200 years back where the compact chose differently, and in that version we have a seat on the primary assembly. We have a fleet. We have a word in the governance of the region. He paused. She cried. Okonkwo, she wasn't a crier. She had a reputation on our unit for being the steadiest person in any room. She read about that version of us, and she sat down on the floor of Station 3's archive, and she put her face in her hands and she cried. He said it without apology, without the male instinct toward stoicism that some of the compact's sociological literature claimed was a human characteristic. He said it like it was information, like it was exactly what happened, and there was no version of telling the story where he was going to smooth it over. And then, he said, she stood up. And she told me that she was going to copy the entire archive onto our extraction transport's black box recorder, and that she would strap herself to the outside of the hull if that's what it took to get it back to Earth. The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence than the others. Sova Thresh sat with it. What happened to her? She asked, though she already knew. The compact's security team at Station 1 detected the data transfer. They had 15 minutes before we made extraction window. His voice had gone very level, the way structural materials under load go level, not calm but bearing weight. She got the transfer completed. She stayed with the transport's communication relay to make sure the black box transmission went through before they reached us. I told her not to. I told her there were other ways. She told me. He stopped. She waited. She told me that she'd read 12 cycles of records about what happens when someone decides in advance that we're not worth the chance. And she'd seen what we become when someone decides that we are. And she had made her choice about which version of us was going to show up today. The amber sky was absolutely still. No movement in it. Not even the far glints of transit vessels that occasionally crossed the integration center's visual range. The data reached Earth, Sova Thresh asked. It reached a relay station. I don't know if it was ever retrieved. I don't know if anyone on Earth even knows it's there. He looked at her steadily. I don't know if any of this matters. And there it was. The question beneath everything. The thing that had been living in him for 14 months in a room that locked from the outside, looking out a window at a sky that wasn't his sky. It matters, she said. You're an intelligence assessor for the compact. Yes. Your job is to determine how dangerous we are. Yes. And she was quiet for a moment. Then she reached forward and turned the datapad over on the table, screen down, which accomplished nothing practically since it was already face down, but which was the gesture she needed to make. My file, she said. When I was assessed for this position, do you know what the recommendation said? He shook his head slightly. It said I was a risk for emotional overinvestment in subjects of study. that I had a tendency to develop what the evaluator called inappropriate analytical sympathies, that I should be placed in roles involving non-sapient subjects wherever possible. She paused. My supervisor overrode the recommendation. She said that the ability to see past the category to the individual was the only trait she'd ever found that separated a useful intelligence assessor from a very expensive data filing system. Something in his face changed. The landscape that had been living there, the guilt that wasn't quite guilt, the weight shifted, not gone but redistributed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sova Thresh." She paused. "Third designation investigative, but that's a title. My name is Sova." "Callum," he said. "The sergeant part is, I think it might be vestigial at this point." "Callum," she said, "I need you to tell me everything, not for my report, or for my report eventually, but not only for that. I need to understand what happened at Cathara in a way that makes it real rather than archived, because the decision about what the compact does next with the window and with your species is going to be made by people who have only ever seen the archived version." She held his gaze. "I read your file in my first week of this assignment. I have been trying to find a way to sit across from you since the third day." He looked at her for a long time. "Why?" "Because the file, the parts that made it through, the sensor logs and the autopsy report and the extraction manifest, they were about what happened. But there were places where the record stopped and the only thing left was the space where a person had been, and I kept," she stopped, assembled the thought more carefully. "When someone's record shows you what they chose to do under the worst possible conditions, and the choice was to stay with the transmission relay until the data got through because she had decided which version of her species she wanted to be, that's not a threat profile. That's something else entirely. And I have been trying to find the right word for 14 months. Callum was very still. "Courage," he said. "The word you're looking for is probably courage." "I know that word," she said. "All the species in the compact have a version of that word. I have analyzed courage as a variable in threat matrix calculations for 9 years. She paused. This was different. "How?" She considered. "Most courage is situational. Most courage occurs in response to an immediate threat. The survival impulse finds a channel, and the channel is the brave action. What Specialist Okonkwo did was not situational. She had time to think. She had time to calculate the outcome. She knew the result before it happened, and she did it anyway, not because the survival impulse overrode her reasoning, but because her reasoning led her there." She paused again. "That's the thing that's not in the file. That's the part I needed someone to tell me in their own words." Something happened to Callum's face that she had not seen before in their exchange. It was not the near smile, and it was not the careful steadiness. It was something more unguarded, a brief honest cracking, like a wall that had been load-bearing for a long time, deciding it didn't have to hold everything by itself anymore. "She was the best person I ever served with," he said. "I don't mean the most capable, I mean the best. She read faster, thought faster, got to the core of a problem while the rest of us were still framing it. But that wasn't it. It was that she was the kind of person who, when you were in the dark and you were scared, she would tell you exactly what she was scared of, and somehow that made it less." He exhaled. "We were scared, all of us. The whole 12 hours at Cathara we were scared. She never pretended otherwise. She decided something." "What did she decide?" "That the version of us in the window mattered more than the version of us in our orders." His voice was quiet, but it had no tremor in it now. It had the quality of something that had found ground. That if the compact looked through that window and saw who we could be, who we already were, in a version of events where they led us, then she was going to be that person. Right then. In the time she had. Sova Thresh sat with this for a long time. Outside, in the integration center's corridor, she could hear the soft sounds of facility operation. A distant door, a maintenance system cycling, the small mechanical breath of a building that processed and contained and managed. She was aware, sitting in this courtyard, that she was one of the people who operated these systems. that her work was part of the Compact's comprehensive apparatus for deciding what other species were and what to do about them. She was also aware that she had flagged 13 passages in a file when she was allowed to flag 3, and had been trying to get into this courtyard for 14 months, and had turned her datapad face down on the table because she didn't want the recording to catch the expression on her face. "The black box relay," she said carefully, "the one at the transit station." He watched her. "I have access clearances for transit network archive data as part of my assessment protocols." She kept her voice even. "It would be within the scope of a supplementary investigation to query for anomalous transmissions in the Cathara corridor during the relevant time frame. The data would be 14 months old. Transit black box archives have a 24-month retention window." 10 months, he said quietly. "It's been sitting there 10 months. "Within the retention window," she confirmed. He was looking at her with the gray-green attention that read things behind faces, and she held it. She was aware of what she was doing. She had been aware of it, she thought, since approximately the 3rd day, when she'd read the passage in the file about the data transfer and had thought, someone should go find that. "Why?" he asked her. The same question he'd asked before, but it meant something different this time. "The same reason specialist Okonkwo stayed with the relay," she said. "I read what's in the file, and I decided which version of me I wanted to be today." Something moved across his face. She would have called it recognition, except that the species in question weren't supposed to be capable of recognizing things in each other across the gap of categorically different biology and history and culture and skin, and 7 years of managed containment. The assessor literature was very clear on this point. She had been flagging passages in the assessor literature, privately, for years. "Sova," he said, "just the name. First designation, no title." "Yes. Thank you for coming. Thank you for talking about it." She paused. "I know you haven't. I know why. 14 months of talking to people whose job is to decide what you are tends to produce a certain caution about what you say." "It wasn't caution," he said, which surprised her. "Not exactly," he thought for a moment. "When something happens that big, something that matters that much, there's a version of talking about it that makes it smaller. That processes it into something manageable and archivable, and I didn't want to do that to her, to what she chose. I wanted to leave it as big as it actually was for as long as I could." He looked at her. "You didn't make it smaller," he said. She was quiet. She was not, she was discovering, immune to human facial inefficiency. Her own species' expressional register was narrower and more internal, but something was moving in it that she thought the behavioral analysts monitoring the courtyard through the facility's sensors might make a note of. She made herself not care about that. "I'm going to write my report," she said. "It's going to say that you represent a threat profile that requires continued observation and a substantially expanded assessment mandate." He tilted his head slightly. "That's the language that authorizes regular contact sessions between the subject and the assessing analyst," she said. "Ongoing, indefinite duration. Highly unusual for an assessment at this stage, but the mandate allows for it in cases of exceptional complexity." He understood. She could see him understand. "How often?" he said. "As often as the mandate requires," she said, "which I will determine." She paused. "I'll want to hear more about the 12 hours, about your team, about—" She stopped, restarted. "I want to know everything that didn't make it into the file. I want to know it the way it actually was." He looked at the amber sky one more time. Then he looked back at her. "It's a long story," he said. "I have clearance for extended sessions. Some of it isn't very," he paused. "Some of it's just ordinary. People getting scared and getting hungry and making bad jokes because it's the only thing that helps. Some of it's just human." "I know," she said. "That's the part I want most." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, His voice had the quality of something carefully stored that had been brought out into the air for the first time, not fragile, not damaged by the storage, but simply not yet breathed-on. Private. Real. Okonkwo had this thing she did, he said. When things were bad, she'd start humming just under her breath, you could barely hear it. An old song. Something her grandmother used to sing to her. He paused. She was humming it while she held the relay. The last time I saw her, she was sitting cross-legged on the deck with both hands on the transmission coupling, and she was humming. Sovethresh held this. What was the song? She asked. I don't know the words, he said. I only know how it sounds. And then, unexpectedly, without any preamble or self-consciousness, he hummed a few bars of it, a simple, rising melody, unadorned, the kind of thing you'd hum without thinking while doing something that needed doing. 4 or 5 notes, a pattern that repeated. In the Integration Center courtyard, under the amber sky, the melody lasted about 10 seconds. It was the most important thing she had heard in 9 years of assessment work. She came back the next day, and the day after that. The facility administrator, a quiet, precisely efficient individual named Sekmora who processed an enormous amount of paperwork, without appearing to process anything at all, began leaving an extra chair at the courtyard gate when Sovathresh's access request came through. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that happens in bureaucratic institutions when the people who work in them quietly decide that something matters more than the form it's supposed to take. The courtyard sessions developed a rhythm. Callum would be in the yard when she arrived, and there would be a period of settling coffee that she'd started bringing from outside the facility, which the behavioral monitoring logs noted he drank very quickly, and with an expression that the analysts apparently couldn't categorize. And then the telling. He was a methodical storyteller. He didn't rush toward the significant moments. He built toward them the way a careful engineer builds toward a load-bearing structure, establishing the base first, the materials, the conditions, so that when the weight came down it was supported by something real. He told her about the approach to Kithara. The transit had been 11 days, which was long enough for the team to move from professional distance into the specific intimacy of people who are going to face something difficult together and know it. He described the architecture of that intimacy in precise terms, not sentimental, not clinical, but accurate the way only direct experience is accurate. Vasquez doing pull-ups in the corridor at 2 in the morning and not explaining why. Pillar baking bread in the transit kitchen, using a starter she'd kept alive in a sealed container for 3 years of extended postings, and the smell of it filling the ship and making something release in all of them that they hadn't known was held. Dang playing an old strategy game on a handheld device, and asking Okonkwo to explain moves to him that he was clearly already capable of working out himself, because he needed the explaining, needed the sound of a competent voice walking him through things. He was 22, Callum said. Dang, 22 years old, first extended assignment. He'd passed all the training evaluations and he was good, genuinely good, but he'd never been off-world for more than a 60-day rotation, and this was an 11-month deployment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. His file said he was calm under pressure. His evaluators described him as unflappable. He paused. His evaluators had never watched him try to eat when he was scared. He ate everything in the first 20 minutes and then couldn't eat anything for 6 hours. You could track his emotional state entirely through his relationship with food. You were watching him, she said. I was his team lead. I was watching all of them. He glanced at her. That's the job. The mission parameters, the tactical situation, the environmental assessment, those are the things you're trained to track. But the real job, the job that nobody briefs you on and that the assessor's reports never quite capture because they're not there for it, that's the people. What they need, what they have capacity for, where the edge is. She thought about this. The Compact's team structure literature says that effective unit cohesion is a function of role clarity and objective alignment. Callum gave her a look that she was beginning to recognize, the very slight elevation of one eyebrow, the fractional adjustment of his mouth, which meant he was being polite about something he found categorically incorrect. Roll clarity, he said. Objective alignment. That's the literature. Sova, the single most important thing that happened on that transit was Pillar's bread. He said it without irony, not because of some efficiency metric, because a ship full of people going toward something dangerous smelled something that smelled like home, and they sat down in the kitchen together and nobody talked about the mission for 4 hours, and when they left they were different, more solid, more willing to be in the same place as each other. He paused. That's not in the Compact's team structure literature. No, she said, it isn't. What is it in, then, in your assessment frameworks? She considered. Morale optimization is a subcategory in the Personnel Stability Index, she said. It's weighted at about 8% of the overall readiness calculation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a care that she recognized as the inverse of cruelty, 8%. 8%. The data from 12 cycles of observation in the window, he said slowly. Was that in there? The bread. And she thought about this because she had read those archives, the portions of them that were in the file and the portions of them that she'd retrieved from the transit relay, and she had been struck repeatedly by the particularity of what the Compact's research teams had recorded. They had recorded the large movements, the political decisions, the military confrontations and their outcomes. But they had also, she noticed now, recorded the small things, the things that didn't fit cleanly into categories. The handoffs, the gestures, the music. Yes, she said. In one of the adjacent records, the version where first contact went well, the documentation notes that the initial delegation included what they described as a food-sharing protocol. The human representatives brought items from their home regions and distributed them before the formal proceedings. The observation note says, function unclear, possibly ceremonial. Callum looked at her, function unclear. Possibly ceremonial. He laughed, the first time she'd heard him laugh, which the behavioral monitoring logs would later note as an anomaly. It was a short sound, genuine and slightly exasperated, the kind of laugh that happens when something is both funny and sad at exactly the same time. They were feeding people, he said. That's all. They were feeding people because they were nervous, and feeding people is what you do when you're nervous and you want things to go well. He shook his head. 12 cycles of observation, and the conclusion was, function unclear, possibly ceremonial. We are a very thorough people, she said, and often completely wrong. He looked at her sharply, and then he laughed again, and this time it lasted longer. She found that she did not mind being the source of it. She filed this information in the part of her mind that she was becoming increasingly aware was not, technically, a professional information archive. On the 6th session, he told her about the moment the mission changed. Not the moment they discovered the device, not the moment Vethoron told them what the Compact had been doing. The moment before all of that, the moment that he said he had carried the longest, and that he had never told anyone because it contained nothing tactical, nothing that would mean anything in a debriefing, nothing that translated into the language of assessments and incident reports. They had been 2 days out from Cathara. The mission brief was still technically a calibration check. He had been in the observation alcove at the rear of the transit ship, going over the documentation they'd been given on the Cathara system's layout. Okonkwo came in and sat across from him without announcement, which was her way. She treated shared space as shared, and the concept of interrupting a superior officer as a slightly silly formality. She sat down and she was quiet for a minute, which was unusual for her. Okonkwo was not a silence person. She thought by talking, generated clarity through words, and the quality of silence that she developed in the transit observation alcove that night had a weight to it that Callum noticed immediately. He put down the documentation. "Talk to me," he said. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the classified designation." "The mission designation." The whole package. 3 levels above your clearance, 2 above mine, sealed at origin, no transparency protocol, no after-action framework. She was looking at the transit observation window, which at 2 days out showed a star field and nothing recognizable. I've been on 8 extended deployments. I've had classified designations before, but there's usually a structure to them, a reason that's visible at least in outline, even if the details aren't. This one doesn't have an outline. Operations without visible outlines are usually either very important or very messy, he said. Or both, she said. Cal. She used the shortened form of his name, which she did only when something was serious. If it's both, if we get there and it's important in a way we weren't told about and messy in a way we weren't prepared for, what do we do? He had thought about this before. Every team lead thought about it, the gap between the orders as given and the situation as encountered, and the question of what you were actually for when those two things didn't match. We do what's right, he said. She gave him a look that was not, quite, criticism, more like the careful examination of something she wanted to be sure she understood correctly. That's very clean. It's supposed to be simple, he said. The definition of right is the complicated part. She was quiet again. Then she said, what if right means doing something that costs us something we can't get back? He had looked at her. 26 years old, Specialist Adiz Okonkwo, fastest reader he'd ever worked with, steadiest person in any room, which her evaluators had noted and he had confirmed, and which was somehow even more impressive up close than in a report, because steadiness in a report is a static quality and steadiness in a person is a continuous achievement. She was steady because she kept choosing to be. He had watched her choose it, over 8 months of deployment and the 11 days of transit, in small ways that added up to a character. Then it costs us that, he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded when she had established something she didn't need to revisit. Okay, she said, good. She stood up, she went back to her bunk, the transit continued. 2 days later, she was reading in the archive room of Station 3, and she stood up and she knocked on his door and she said, Cal, you need to see this. He'd said, what is it? She'd said, you need to see all of it at once or it doesn't land. He'd gone with her, he'd seen it, the 12 cycles of parallel world documentation. The version where first contact was different. The version where humanity was given the chance and became what it was capable of becoming. He understood, standing there, what she had been asking him 2 nights before. What if right means doing something that costs us something we can't get back? He had answered without knowing the specifics of the cost. He had answered from the foundation of what he believed about what the word meant, and she had taken the answer and stored it carefully and used it when the time came. She asked you, Sovethresh said quietly, to make the decision before you knew what you were deciding. Yes. So you couldn't walk it back. So I couldn't walk it back, he confirmed. So when it was real, the decision was already made. She'd built the structure before we hit the load. His voice was something complicated. I've thought about whether she manipulated me, whether that was what it was. And she knew me, he said simply. She knew what I'd say to the abstract version because she knew what I believed. She wasn't manipulating me, she was trusting me. He paused. She was also making sure of me. Those aren't contradictory. No, Sovethresh said, they're not. She thought about her own supervisor, who had overridden an evaluator's recommendation and placed a risk of inappropriate sympathies analyst in the most human-facing role in the division. She thought about the difference between being manipulated towards something and being trusted toward it. She thought about 13 flagged passages. I think, she said carefully, that the people who trust us most are often the people who prepare the ground before we know we're walking on it. He looked at her with the gray-green attention. Is that what you did with the transit relay data? I retrieved it within my authorized access parameters, she said, which was true in exactly the technical way that technical truths can be true while containing a great deal of other information. Sova, I knew what I was doing, she said. I knew what I was building toward. I just needed you to keep talking long enough for the foundation to be solid before the weight came down. He was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, the near smile became something else. Something that had more warmth in it and more steadiness, and less of the careful management of a person in a room that locked from the outside. Okonkwo would have liked you, he said. It was the most important thing he had said to her. She understood this immediately and completely, and she said nothing, because some things don't need to be answered, and she was learning slowly to tell the difference. The report she submitted to third auditor Len was 27 pages. It was the longest assessment document in the division's active records. It used language that her supervisor would recognize as procedurally standard, and that any informed reader would recognize as carefully, precisely weaponized. Every phrase chosen to use the compact's own protocols against the compact's own assumptions. The threat classification was assessed as requiring immediate escalation to the adjudication chamber. The nature of the threat, as she defined it, was the existence of documentation demonstrating that the compact's current management framework for the human species is predicated on a set of assumptions about human potential that the compact's own research, conducted over 12 cycles at considerable expense, has conclusively disproven. The recommended action was immediate review of the Cathara incident classification status, retrieval of the transit relay black box archive, and full reassessment of human integration policy. The secondary recommendation, added in a footnote on page 27, was Subject Human Terrestrial Survivor 7, Sergeant Callum Reach, to be reclassified from containment status to advisory status, effective immediately. On grounds that his knowledge of the Cathara incident represents an irreplaceable intelligence asset that cannot be adequately accessed under current conditions of custodial restriction. Len read the report. She read it twice. She called Sova Thresh into her office and looked at her with the flat frills and the complicated expression she'd worn in their first meeting. "You know what you're doing," Len said. "I know what I'm recommending," Sova Thresh said, "on the basis of assessment evidence." "You know what I mean." Sova Thresh was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I know." Len turned the report over in her hands. The frills shifted, not the displeasure pattern but something older than that, something that had been in the species for longer than bureaucratic titles. "The adjudication chamber is going to push back," she said. "I expect so. The Outer Survey Division is going to claim the research was conducted under protocols that have since been superseded. They can claim that. The archive timestamps will not agree with them." Len looked at the report. "You retrieved the transit relay data." "I retrieved an anomalous transmission log from the Cathara corridor within my authorized access parameters for transit network data review," Sova Thresh said. "The content of that log is appended as Exhibit 14C through 14J. Len was quiet for a very long time. Then she set the report down on her desk, and she reached for her access authentication tile, and she pressed it to the report's verification seal. The seal shifted from pending to authorized. "Submitted to chamber," she said, with a notation of exceptional priority. She looked up. "Go back and see your subject. Write your first session follow-up." "I already have an appointment scheduled," Sova Thresh said. "Of course you do." The frills moved again. If Sova Thresh had been asked to name the expression, she would have said, "Careful pride." The kind that knows it's taking a risk and has decided, in the manner of a certain kind of species with a certain kind of mind, that the risk is worth it. Don't take too many notes. "I never do," Sova Thresh said. "The important parts I remember." The transit relay data took 6 weeks to process, through the compact's archival authentication protocols. During those 6 weeks, Sova Thresh held 11 sessions with Callum Reach. By the end of the 3rd session, she had stopped bringing the datapad entirely. By the 5th, the facility's behavioral monitoring logs noted, with what she imagined was institutional bewilderment, that the subject was observed to be laughing during a portion of the session. By the 9th, the logs noted that both the subject and the analyst were observed to be laughing at the same time, which the behavioral division apparently flagged as an anomaly requiring review. She did not take many notes, she remembered instead. He told her about Okonkwo teaching him to play a card game during 18 hours of transit downtime that she'd explained required significant mathematical reasoning, and that he had beaten her at twice, which she disputed vigorously, loudly, and with the specific energy of someone who knew they were wrong. He told her about the other members of their team, Vasquez, who kept a small photograph in his vest pocket and had never let anyone see it, Pillar, whose hobby was competitive baking, and who had once attempted to explain sourdough fermentation to a compact customs officer for 20 minutes before anyone stopped her. Young specialist Dang, who had been on his first extended assignment, and who had been seasick during transit even though there was no motion sickness to be had in null gravity, and he'd insisted unconvincingly that it wasn't seasickness. He told her about the 12 hours in the Cathara stations, with the full weight and texture of 12 hours. The fear, yes, but also the bad jokes, also Vasquez sharing something from a flask that he declined to identify. Also Okonkwo's voice saying things quietly in the dark that were neither speeches nor orders, but just the sound of a person thinking out loud about what mattered. He told her slowly the parts that were just ordinary, the parts that were just human. And she listened the way she had learned to listen, not as an analyst building a file, not as an assessor constructing a threat matrix, but as someone who had decided, in the first week of a new assignment, which version of herself she wanted to be. On the 43rd day, the adjudication chamber called a full emergency session. The Cathara incident classification was suspended pending review. 3 members of the Outer Survey Division's administrative structure were placed on administrative review. The transit relay data was authenticated and entered into the official record. And on the 44th day, Sova Thresh walked into the Integration Center's administrator's office and filed the paperwork that reclassified Callum Reach from containment status to advisory status, effective immediately. She handled the paperwork herself. She was present when the room lock mechanism was disengaged. He came out into the corridor, and he looked at the full-height windows that showed the amber sky, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her. "What happens now?" he said. "That," she said, "is an excellent question. I've submitted a recommendation regarding a human advisory role in the data authentication process. You'd be reviewing the archive material and providing contextual annotations. It's within the scope of the advisory status classification." He looked at her steadily. "That's not what I'm asking." She was quiet. "I know," she said. The amber sky was lighter at this hour than it was in the courtyard, a different angle of the facility's orientation to the local star. She had learned, over 44 days, what the sky looked like at different hours, which aspects of it corresponded to which points in his restricted daily schedule, which window in which corridor showed which slice of it. She had learned this not from the facility documentation, but because she had started arriving early and staying late, which she had told herself was for the continuity of her reporting, and which she was no longer bothering to tell herself. "There's going to be a review period," she said. "The Chamber's timeline for the Cathara reassessment is probably 12 to 18 months. During that period, my assessment mandate is active, which means—" "Regular contact," he said. "Indefinite duration," she confirmed. He was looking at her with the gray-green attention, and she held it, and something between them had the quality of something that had been building since the third day, since the flagged passages, since the turned-over datapad, since the melody that lasted 10 seconds in a courtyard under an amber sky. She used to say, he said quietly, that the version of us in the window mattered because it proved something, not about what we were but about what we're capable of becoming, that the conditions matter, that given the right conditions we become something worth becoming. He paused. I didn't have anyone to say that to, for a long time. You have someone now, she said. It was not a complicated sentence. It did not attempt to encompass or manage the distance between their species, the protocols of her department, the complexity of what was still unresolved and might remain unresolved, the months ahead and what they would or would not contain. It just said the thing that was true. He understood it exactly the way she meant it. Sova, he said. Yes. I've been looking at that sky for 14 months, he said. Do you know what I was looking for? She thought about it. Something familiar, she said. Something that looked like someone was going to come through it, he said. Someone who read the file and decided it mattered. He paused. It took a while. I was very thorough, she said. I flagged 13 passages. I know, he said. They showed me the report, the intake team. 14 months ago when they were telling me there was no incident. His voice was very quiet. They said an intelligence assessor had flagged my file for priority follow-up and that the request had been denied. They said it like it was supposed to make me feel managed. He paused. Instead, I thought, someone read it. Someone read the file and wanted to know. The corridor was quiet. The administrator was at her desk and not looking at them, which was the professional courtesy of someone who processed a lot of paperwork and had learned to give people a moment. I'm sorry it took so long, Sova said. You got here, he said. That's the part that matters. She thought about the 13 flagged passages. She thought about Len's expression when she'd submitted the 27-page report. She thought about 11 sessions in a courtyard, and the transit relay data and the 44th day. She thought about a specialist sitting, cross-legged on a deck plate with both hands on a transmission coupling, humming a melody her grandmother had taught her, deciding which version of her species she wanted to be. I want to hear the rest of it, she said. Everything you haven't told me yet. That's a lot, he said. I have clearance for extended sessions, she said. Indefinite duration, she paused. And I remember better than I take notes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened to his face that was not the near smile and was not the careful steadiness and was not the brief honest cracking. It was something new, an expression she didn't have a name for, that she was going to have to develop a name for, because she was going to be seeing it for a long time. Okay, he said. Yeah, all right. It was the same thing he'd said at the beginning in the courtyard, when she'd asked him to tell her everything. But it sounded completely different now. It sounded like a door that had been closed for a long time opening onto the right room. She had a thought, standing there in the corridor with the full-height windows spreading the amber sky ahead of them, that she would probably not put in any report. She was thinking about what the observation archive had recorded about the adjacent version of First Contact, the documentation the Compact's researchers had gathered over 12 cycles and classified so thoroughly that it took 17 access barriers and 1 determined analyst to find. She was thinking about the note that Vethoron had written at the bottom of her observation log in the 12th cycle of the study, not in the official documentation. In the margin of a personal working copy that no one was supposed to see, that had made it into the transit relay data, because Okonkwo had copied everything, and she had literally meant everything. Vethoron's marginal note read, "The adjacent version does not tell us anything we did not already know. It only tells us what becomes possible when we decide it is." Sova had read that line and sat with it for a very long time. She had been sitting with it in various ways since the first week, since the 13 flagged passages, since the datapad turned face down on a courtyard table. The compact believed had built an entire governance architecture on the belief that the conditions you placed species in were a response to what those species were. You managed what you found. You designed the containment to fit the contained. The 12 cycles of window documentation said something different. They said the conditions you place a species in are not a response to what they are. They are a decision about what you will permit them to become. And the difference between those two positions is, when you follow it to its end, the difference between every version of First Contact that had ever gone wrong and the single adjacent version where it went right. She had been thinking about this since the first week. She understood now, acting on it. The report, the transit relay retrieval, the 44 days and the 11 sessions and the face-down data pad that recorded nothing while something real was built. Every decision she had made in the past 44 days had been made from the same position, not a response to what he was, but a decision about what she would permit him to become. What she would permit them to become together, in the space her choices created. The compact would argue, and would not be entirely wrong, that this was professionally compromised behavior in an intelligence assessor. Sova Thresh had begun to think that this was the most professionally accurate thing she had ever done. Callum was looking at her. He had the capacity, she had learned over 11 sessions, for a particular quality of patience. The patience of a person who had spent 14 months waiting and had used the time not to become bitter but to become very still. He could hold a silence without filling it. He could wait for the thing to be said rather than the easier thing. She appreciated this more than she had expected to when she sat down across from him in the courtyard for the first time and began to understand slowly what the file had not managed to contain. She fell into step beside him, and they walked out into the larger corridor, and the amber sky spread out ahead of them through the facility's full-height windows, and neither of them was looking at it like someone waiting for something anymore. They were looking at it like people who were already where they needed to be, ready to begin the next part of a story that had started, in all the ways that mattered, the day she read his file. In the first week, when she decided he was worth finding.